taught me right from wrong and told me always to be strong. But now I'm better off alone, searching for a better home. All I want is a little piece of heaven. All I need, a little piece of heaven. All I want is a little piece of heaven. All I need, a little piece of heaven. But you're
Hello and welcome. If you could please take your seats. My name is John O'Brien, Head of Communications with MCC Brussels, and I'd like to welcome those who have come along tonight in person and those who are joining us on the live stream. Professor Frank Furedi has been a dynamic presence in Brussels for the last 2 years since the founding of the think tank MCC Brussels that was set up to challenge the status quo and shake up the Brussels bubble. But beyond the work as a think tank, Frank is also an internationally renowned sociologist. He's a media commentator. Professor Furedi serves as an Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury. But we're here to look at the author, Frank Furedi. He has published over 25 books, translated into 16 languages, and is known for his insightful analysis of cultural developments in Western societies. The book we're here to launch and discuss tonight is The War Against the Past: Why the West Must Fight for Its History. In his latest book, Professor Furedi explores the current cultural crusade against history, where the past is often dismissed as toxic, from toppling statues to erasing historical terms from our vocabulary. There is an ongoing effort to make the past an object of disdain. Frank Furedi poses essential questions. What is driving this cultural shift? What are the dangers of erasing or condemning Western history? Frank argues that a society that loses touch with its past is left in a permanent crisis of identity. To help us unpack those issues, I'm delighted that one of the longest serving foreign journalists in Brussels has joined us. Bruno Waterfield from The Times will help unpack what Frank is getting at in the book and hopefully be able to field questions from you, the audience, because at MCC Brussels, we believe it's very important that the audience be involved in our discussions. I'm going to hand over to you now, Frank, okay?
Good evening, everybody. I wrote this book unintentionally. I got a phone call from an editor in Polity Press saying, Frank, it's time you wrote a book on the culture wars. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, I've been reading your stuff, and you've been going on and on about what's happening in terms of the way that history is being challenged and called into question. And it'd be good if you could look into the question deeply. Now, I wasn't really aware of the fact that I was writing these things, because I write a lot of stuff. But then I realized that in the back of my mind, I had unconsciously become aware of the fact that almost subliminally and systematically, the European past, the Western past, was being called into question. There's nothing wrong with calling that into question. I think we should always criticize whatever has happened before us, but it wasn't simply being criticized, it was being systematically annihilated and destroyed. And I remember that every single figure in human history that I admire has been cast in the worst possible light. So you look at someone like Aristotle, and Aristotle is really, in many respects, the most important philosopher for me. According to the most recent versions of Aristotle, he's meant to be the father of white supremacy. It's a really idiotic idea that somehow poor old Aristotle, who had no notion of color or anything of that sort, would somehow become the father of racism. It made no sense because, as you all know, in the Greek days, they did make a distinction between Greeks and barbarians, but the barbarians were defined by the fact they didn't speak Greek rather than by anything else. So you kind of go around and you look at things more carefully. Every philosopher I know, including someone like Immanuel Kant or David Hume or Adam Smith, have all been, in a sense, kind of castigated and denounced for their white privilege. And literally anybody that moves in the realm of philosophy or religion has been almost reinterpreted in different ways. So for example, I don't know if any of you heard of William Shakespeare, but I used to think that he was a playwright. You know, he used to write plays, and that's what his business was. When you read the way that history is being rewritten, Shakespeare becomes this apologist of colonialism, imperialism, and what they call whiteness. Now what has happened, and this is why I wrote the book, is that it's not simply that Shakespeare is being attacked for something that he wasn't. You know, we all make mistakes. I sometimes attacked my father for things that he wasn't, and I realized afterwards. But he also, there's an arrogance, and the arrogance is that we can rewrite Shakespeare in accordance with our present-day imagination. So some of Shakespeare's plays have been rewritten recently by people who say that they want to make the words in the play sound more racist than Shakespeare used. And say, well, why do you want to have racist words put into his play? And it says, well, all that we're doing is we're making explicit what was implicit in Shakespeare's writings. In other words, they're saying that they know better than Shakespeare what he was really thinking. And the arrogance of people in the 21st century projecting themselves back into the 16th, 17th century and rewriting Shakespeare, in other words, teaching Shakespeare a lesson, like the way a schoolmaster does to a 9-year-old, really sums up the horrific nature of these kinds of attacks. And I wrote the book very simply because I came to the conclusion that actually when you look at the culture wars, you will find that the culture wars today are principally about what the past represents. It's really about the terrain of the past and fighting out the conflicts in relation to the past. And I think that's something that is really quite important, because if we lose our connection with the past, which is what they're trying to do, if they destroy the organic link which all of us have with the past, and I know there are bad things in the past, not everything was good in the past, but if you lose our connections to our ancestors, to the communities we come from, we essentially become uprooted, disconnected. It means that young people become dispossessed of their cultural inheritance. And once people become isolated from what has gone on beforehand, they become unaware of who they are, what they're about. Their place in the world is called into question. And once your place in the world is called into question, you not only suffer from an identity crisis, but because you lost your connection with the past, you have no idea about what is the road towards the future. So it's precisely because of the importance of us knowing the way ahead, what our future is, the importance of taking with us the legacy of humanity and making that legacy part of ourselves, part of our humanity, that I wrote the book. It's a book that's really about giving humanism a 21st century expression. So that's what it's about. I hope I get a chance to look at it, and I'd be delighted to listen to your criticisms, your questions. If you tell me where I went wrong, what needs to be corrected, I'm totally open to that, because I know that even though I sometimes come across as sounding a little bit confident, I'm very much aware of the fact that I don't know the answer to everything.
Yeah, I've known Frank for over 30 years. He's a decent guy. He's written dozens of books, but I've always seen him, and actually seen him, he's always been in the front line on two really important issues, the biggest questions of this 21st century, which is freedom and standing up for our common humanist inheritance. And that is why this book is a very important book. And just look at the background to it. We're here tonight in the Press Club, which is a brilliant venue, and thanks to Laurent, because another venue cancelled it. And this is the arrogance, the insouciance in which venues cancel people. They don't even have to apologise for it. People just shrug, who cares? And that's a really, really big problem. Cancel culture, shutting down debate, is underpinned by this war against the past. I was also thinking about this book this weekend. I went to a bookshop in London called Hatchard's, a really wonderful bookshop that's been there for a few hundred years. And I wanted to buy a book for my daughter, not a very serious book, A Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. And you might not know this, but Roald Dahl's books have been rewritten. The official versions, or the ones that are on display in the shop, have been rewritten by this group of people who are called sensitivity readers. And they decide what is and what isn't appropriate for my children to read in a book. And I took amongst other books, I took the Charlie and Chocolate Factory up to the till to pay for it. And the woman behind the till sort of leant forward, sort of confidentially, and said, look, I don't know if you know, but this is the politically correct censored version. If you want the real one, you have to go upstairs, and behind on the display, there's a little table, and we've got the real ones there. So, of course, I ran up the stairs, to get the real ones, and then came back downstairs, and I said to her, thanks for that, because if I discovered I had bought the censored one, I would have bought it back. I would have been horrified. And she said, yeah, I think that quite a lot of people feel like that. But this is what we've come to. We've come to a situation when you buy a book, the bookseller speaks to you in hushed voices to warn you that you're not getting the real one. You're not getting what the author wrote. You're getting a book that, to quote Penguin, has language, themes, or characterizations which you might find outdated. We have sought to edit words that we regard as unacceptable to present-day readers. Look at the arrogance of that, the arrogance of their intervention, the arrogance of them severing the link between the reader, my daughter, a 7-year-old girl, and the original text, one of the funniest, wittiest, most brilliant children's books. And that is what we've come to. So this is a very, very, very timely book indeed. But Frank, we went for a coffee and beforehand, and Frank was saying that in this book he develops a sociology of the past, or he applies the sociological method to the past, and that's quite new. Could you explain what you've done and why it is new?
So this is, it's a bit specialist, but basically, when you think of the past, you got this sense of something that happened before. But what's really is going on is not that there is this abstract past, but that every culture, every society at different times has got what I call a sense of the past. So the sense of the past is basically a culture's way of making sense of the past. It changes all the time. And what I do in one of my first chapters, it's something that as an academic, and I felt very strongly about, is to actually explain what the word past means. Almost everybody thinks that the term past is self-evident, but it really isn't. Because it wasn't until the Renaissance period when people began to understand that there is such a thing as historical change, that there's a distinction between the past and the present, that our modern idea of the past developed. Now, before I lose you, I think what is really important here is to understand that the relationship between the past and the present and the future is perceived by people like yourselves very, very differently. So, for example, if you think that the past was horrible, as many people in culture think, and the cultural elites promote that, if you think the past was horrible, that influences the way you look at the future. Okay, so children in school learn about the past, and they learn that they should be ashamed about the past. And because they learn to be ashamed about the past, they find it very difficult to be optimistic about the future. If our ancestors screwed up so much and were such bad people, then we don't think very much of human beings. So how can we think of the future as being something that we see as better than the present, something where we can make things happen, have a sense of adventure? And that's precisely what has happened. So if you go on Netflix, or if you watch a Hollywood film where they represent the future, it's almost impossible to see a film where the future is presented as positive. You don't find very many films where in the future representation people are smiling at each other, they're very nice to each other, they love each other. Instead, the future is always represented in a dystopic kind of a way, as a horrible horror show where people do the most degraded kind of a way. So the point I'm trying to make is that I felt that it was very important to explain what the past means in slightly more abstract terms than we usually talk about it, in order to dig deeper and to understand what the culture wars are really all about. Because my principal aim in here is to explain the culture war in a way that doesn't just simply look at its superficial symptoms, but looks at its drivers underneath.
Yeah, and one of I think that chapter is extremely important because it roots the whole discussion. And one of the things I found really interesting about the book is how you link the past, the importance of the past, the importance of the legacy, the living traditions of history, and how you locate that within the humanist tradition. It's not a straightforward conservative Burkean or whatever book. You end the book in the conclusion. You start with that great line from Cicero of history is life's teacher. And it's a very important line. It's a very important concept. It gives the past and history a real moral authority. History is life's teacher. And a lot of people find that concept, the idea that the past has a moral authority, that the past can teach us, that we can learn from it. A lot of people find that quite difficult. So what would you say to people who find it quite difficult that the past, that tradition can have that authority for us today?
Well, I would say, first of all, that in 21st century Europe, all forms of authority are called into question. From parental authority, which is seen as inferior to the role of experts, but even expert authority is continually questioned. So there is no such thing as an unproblematic authority. But the important question you raise is this. Throughout the last 2,000 years, people have taken their cue from what has gone on beforehand. People understood that the achievements of their ancestors were on balance important, so that a generation doesn't just begin from nothing. Right? All of us understand that our communities and individuals in our community have contributed to our knowledge of the world, that we are the beneficiaries of the insights of people that lived before us. Now, sometimes those people that lived before us made mistakes, they got things wrong, but the very fact that nevertheless some of those mistakes were eventually corrected means that there's something really positive there. And therefore, for us, there's an important lesson to be learned, because the authority of previous experience is a lived authority, something that we can all benefit from. And that's why I think that upholding the authority of the past is really so important.
It's very striking. I mean, the erosion of this is very striking. So you mentioned the Renaissance, and it was Renaissance thinkers, I think it was Leonardo Bruni, who came up with a periodization of history, antiquity, Tenebrae, the Dark Ages, and then the modern age. And he also, with great pride, said that his Florentine Republic that he led was comparable to the Athens of Pericles. And of course now, if you mention the Athens of Pericles, of Athenian democracy, which inspired people for 2,000 years, many of the modern fighters for liberty have always looked back to Pericles as the inspiration. People will, of course, say, well, Athenian democracy, what did it mean? It was worthless because it had slavery there. So even something as important, a foundation stone of our history, our historical culture, of our civilization, is now regarded as the opposite of what it was. If you talk about Pericles, you're defending slavery. I have actually heard people arguing that if anyone who refers to Pericles, I've heard people criticize Hannah Arendt because she writes glowingly about Periclean democracy and say, well, she's defending slavery. So what happens, Frank? What starts to happen in terms of education? What starts to happen in terms of young people, of the generational transmission of values and ideas, if defending Pericles, if celebrating Pericles is now become a celebration of slavery? What does that mean for us in our cultures?
Well, it means that the past becomes contaminated by our present-day prejudices. And one of the things that has occurred, and I discussed this in the book, is that increasingly we are reading history backwards. We are projecting back into the past our present-day prejudices. And therefore, history looks totally different. So to give you an example, take ancient Egypt. Now, we don't know all that much about ancient Egypt, right? But that doesn't stop people from querying ancient Egypt. Now, what querying ancient Egypt means is this. Archaeologists who go to Egypt and dig up human remains from the Egyptian civilization and put a DNA test to find out who these human remains were, are told that they mustn't call the human remains either the remains of a man or a woman, because we don't know how they would have identified. In other words, you know, it's possible that poor old Cleopatra wasn't a woman, because how do you know how she would have identified thousands of years ago? And within archaeology, yeah, I think they don't like me here either. Within archaeology, there is now a whole school of thought that simply refuses to identify the sex of the human remains that are gone on, because we just don't know whether they were trans people, what their gender was. And they seriously, what they've done is they projected back into the past our present-day concerns. And they're not interested in what really happened in Egypt. What they're interested is making a statement. So when Pericles is attacked for being part of a slave-owning city-state, what they're doing is they're kind of misinterpreting and they're destroying a very important cultural legacy. You have to remember that when Pericles lived, every society had slaves. That was the norm, right? It was integral to human development, and that was the case in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, all over the thing. Now, we don't like slaves. We're against slaves. But the reason why we don't like slaves and we're against slaves is because of the development of the culture that the Athenians unleashed. Without Athenian democracy, without Pericles and their contribution, and the fact that they are beginning to develop an idea that humans are equal, that the first ones to seriously address that question, we never would have developed an idea that it is wrong to treat some human beings as a means to an end. The person that developed that idea most eloquently is Immanuel Kant. In his Ethics, got a cold. And Immanuel Kant is now also called a racist, right? Immanuel Kant is now called a white supremacist, even though Immanuel Kant was the person that developed a critique that would be used to attack racism, 20, 30, 40 years later. So, so this ignorance that we kind of have of reading history backwards, we call it moral anachronism, means that we treat people in the past as if they are our peers, as if they're like 21st century university students in a woke institution.
Okay. Have we got microphones to bring people in from the audience to give Frank a bit of a rest and ask some questions from the audience? So you chart in the book about how the war against the past has become a crusade to detach, to sever, to sunder contemporary society from the past, and you write very eloquently about how in schools, in education, that is the shift from socialization to what you call re-engineering. Could you explain a little bit more about how that works and what it means?
Well, the aim of the school curriculum now is to detach young people from the previous generation, to create a psychic distance between generations. So the aim really is about ensuring that young people learn to be ashamed about where they come from, that they feel guilty about being European, that somehow or another there's an original sin that was committed thousands of years ago, for which today adult society bears responsibility. And what this does is basically create a situation where children learn that there is something inherently wrong and toxic and sinful about the history of their communities. And I think that's very important, because by doing that, you basically create a young generation that is cut off from their origin. And if you cut young people off from their origin, they lose their independence and their capacity to feel any pride in what they are. And that's one of the reasons why, in a different book I argue, that we have what's called an identity crisis being so prevalent, because if you cannot have any pride about where you come from, it's very difficult to develop a strong identity that allows you to make your way in the world.
So following on from that, what exactly is there is a strong relationship between the connection between the present and the past, between us here in the present, our history, and patriotism, for example. And patriotism is one of the concepts, or one of the sentiments is the wrong word, that is very much the focus for this war on the past. So what's the relationship between the historical thinking and patriotism?
Well, patriotism, pride in your community and pride in your nation, has always been really critical because, in a sense, it provides the basis for human solidarity. Now, human beings are not just simply individuals, right? We are individuals and we have our own individual agenda, but we're also part of something a bit bigger than we really are. And that organic connection between you, me, and the people that live in our community, that organic connection, is also one that links us to the generations that preceded us. So I don't know about you, but sometimes when I look at pictures of my great-grandparents, these are pictures taken in the early 20th century, late 19th century. I look at them, and they act as a mirror of who I am. They serve to remind me that I'm part of something much, much bigger than my immediate world. And that kind of sense of organic connection is something that I can bring my son into. So my son is English, you know, his mother is English, but he feels very proud of his Hungarian connection because he understands that there is something almost magical. You know, I hate to use the word magical, but almost spiritual, that comes about through the connections that are integrated and internalized in the process of being socialized. So in that sense, patriotism is important because it gives us the kind of connections that goes way beyond the people that we know face to face. But it also means that when you're traveling in Africa or in Asia, I always know, I remember I spent a year in Kenya doing my PhD. And suddenly in this village where I was doing my research, I hear a voice. It's really, really familiar. You know, and I don't know what that is, but it's very, very familiar. I realize that this woman is speaking Hungarian to another person in the middle of nowhere, right? Suddenly, a kind of connection is kind of created almost subliminally. And I'm only making this point because what patriotism does is it allows us to overcome our individual alienation and understand that there are people like us who think the way we do, eat the same kind of food, pray in the same kind of churches, and in general are essential to confirm and validate our individual existence. And if kids lose that, if kids feel ashamed of their communities, then basically they kind of forced into a situation where they're more or less on their own, having to cope with the challenges of life.
Yeah. And if you could stick your hands up, because Frank, of course, the modern languages, the vernacular itself, through Shakespeare and through other writers, really arises when this sense of a nation, sense of peoples and communities in the historical sense arises. So it seems that, through reading your book, that language and the battles over language is intimately bound up with this. So could you put your hands up, get the microphone, the gentleman at the back there, then there, please.
Isn't in today's world the pivotal problem that fake news is sold and served as truth and vice versa? And nobody seems to care. And you can't control the sources of information anymore, also in the media.
Okay, and then gentleman there right in front of your shirt and tie, yellow shirt.
Thank you, Frank. I think Jacques Maritain in the book Peasant on the Garonne used the term epistemological time warp to describe what you called about the rewriting of Shakespeare's words. But I like to, because I'm Irish, of course, talk
Oh,
about...
my best friends are Irish.
Yeah, the best lookers. That the whole experience of dislocation, you see in Brian Field is played translations about the loss as you move from one language to another, from Irish to English, and all the cultural material and strength that is lost from that. That's compounded in the late 60s by Second Vatican Council, where you have the almost like a bomb going off on the kind of doctrine and liturgy of the church, and we're left almost like with a palimpsest, a kind of empty, like trying to build a foundation on rubble. And your book, I think, brings up something very important about the whole having a sense of continuity with the past, and also a continuity like part of a people, of a nation, as you say, the importance of patriotism. But it really is, what is going on certainly is a war on the past. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Gentleman there in a red jumper, and then if you could bring the mic to the front here, please.
Yeah, hello. I want to draw attention to an anthropological study of the 1930s by Joseph Unwin, and it's called Sex and Culture. He found a connection in between monogamous cultures and the remembrance of the past. According to this study, the whole of human history does not contain a single culture becoming civilized unless it has been absolutely monogamous. Unwin linked strict monogamous ethics to deistic societies with, amongst others, an enhanced memory compared to other cultures with lesser or no sexual restrictions. Furthermore, he claimed that after losing the monogamous ethics, it takes a generation or something to lose the other aspects of the civilized culture. Doesn't this predict quite well what is happening in the Western world the latest decades since the sexual liberation of the 1960s? And to connect the dots further with your book, maybe it also suggests monogamous sex is one of the best creators of identity that might be the success factor of creating a firm and healthy culture, celebrating its difficult past.
Okay, can we have a microphone come forward? Frank, do you want to come back?
No, I'll take a few more.
Okay, here at the front here, and then we'll go back on that side.
Frank, where do you think things went wrong? I mean, I remember when I was in the second grade, and that's 40-odd years ago, my history teacher told us the very first thing you have to learn when you are studying history is never, but never project your current ideas and thoughts on what happens, what happened in the past. And it seems so obvious for us that they told it to 13-year-olds. And where did things go wrong that today scholars are thinking totally differently?
Yeah, well, in America, they now argue that what you're describing, which is anachronism, is a legitimate way of studying history. That we're using the present as a way of interpreting the past because this is the way that we can restore justice. So basically, they encourage different identity groups to discover themselves in the past. So, you know, for example, if you take someone like Joan of Arc, right? Joan of Arc and other strong women in history are increasingly represented either as lesbians or as trans people on the ground that how could a strong woman be a woman or heterosexual woman? So there's a vast literature that basically uses this methodology. But the real reason why this is happening is because in around 1980, 1979, the cultural elites of Europe and America more or less stopped believing in their own intellectual and cultural inheritance. And this is a top-down affair. So if you look at the best universities, the most prestigious cultural institutions all began to denounce their past systematically. And whereas in the past, the elites talked about the good old days, they now began to talk about the bad old days, and everything was a bad old day. So when you have a situation where the guardians of culture, which are the culture elites, betrayed the culture where they come from and encourage people to take a very different view, then it's not surprising that historians and commentators adopt this very primitive way of looking at history, which is the way you described it.
Good evening. Isn't it so that people who are trying to cancel the past are always looking for victims they can defend in order to feel better about themselves, which in turn leads to a perverted feeling of superiority?
Yeah, very good point. Can you pass it back there to the gentleman with his hand up?
Good evening. Correct me if I'm wrong. I kind of hear in the presentation that supreme value we should instill in the children should be a pride for the nation which they live in. So not to go for very far examples, in this case Germans should not repent for the crimes they committed to Europe, but they should keep praising Hitler and Nazis. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay. Pass the microphone on to the gentleman there, please. I'll give you an example on the history teaching. So when I was a kid at school, one of the great history books everyone read when we were taught at school was called Our Island Story, and it was by a historian called R.J. Unstead. Brilliant historian, really popular, amazingly popular. His books were bestsellers. He's out of print. He's not taught in schools anymore, and he's not taught in schools anymore because his books are basically about instilling history as history as a series of developments in which people played a key role, where people changed the society in which they lived in, and that process, that development was continuous, existed in the present, and it was something to be proud of because it was happening in that place, the island of Britain. And he's not taught in schools anymore. Those books have disappeared. There are now new books, and those new books instill the idea that whilst it's fine to be proud of your Afro-Caribbean origins or your Asian Indian origins, one thing you can't be proud of is your British origins. And that's the shift that's taken place in education. Sorry. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about other regions in the world, other continents, other civilizations. How do we think that they think about us because they don't look into their past? I've seen in Hong Kong, in the Historical Museum, cruelties done by the Chinese. The Chinese, they don't look to it like we look to our cruelties. So I think they look to what we're doing today as being very weak versus what they are.
Can I just come in there? Yeah. But the Chinese think we're idiots, and they're right. And what's very interesting is that, so if you talk to Chinese university academics, they will tell you that more people in China read Aristotle, Plato, and the Western classics than they do in the West. And they take it very, very seriously, which indicates to us some of the problems. I just want to answer the German question because it's very important. And also because some of my best friends are German. The Germans did some horrible things. I mean, exceptionally horrible things in the Second World War. The whole Nazi experience is unforgivable. I experienced that personally because my mother was taken to a camp, unfortunately only for 4 months because they occupied Hungary fairly late in the day. So I've got, real problems with that whole experience. But one of the tragedies that has occurred is that the way that German culture has reacted to this is basically by making German young people and a lot of Germans feel guilty about being German. And that's not a good thing, because if you make people feel guilty about who they are, then you do two things that are wrong. First of all, you don't critically assess what the unique features of the Holocaust were, what the unique features of Nazi expansionism were. You just basically see it as part of that kind of guilt. And secondly, what you do is you overlook the fact that German history is not simply about Hitler, right? But there is Heine, there is there is a whole number of classical musicians. There is Immanuel Kant. There is Hegel. I mean, I could name a large names of German contributions that are really central to Western civilization. And I always feel really angry when I meet German academics. I tell them, stop feeling guilty for being German, right? Because that's a cop-out. That's an easy way out. Look at your past critically. See its good bits and its bad bits, and draw up a balance sheet, because that's a more honest and a more useful way of moving forward. You see, I'm not arguing that pride in your country means you uncritically say that everything was good. I'm arguing that what you do is you look at where you come from, you look at the people, you look at the legacy of the past, and in that way you kind of come to a conclusion about what it is about the world that makes you who you are and why that is important.
Can we have a microphone to the back there? Hands up if you want to speak. Yep, so there's a gentleman there, then there, and there, okay?
Question of a journalist for the Dutch media. Dear Professor, dear Frank, I'm following you already for a couple of years, you know.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if you like the Dutch as much as the Irish and the Scottish and the German.
Some of my best friends are
Maybe
Dutch.
after this question, not anymore. But against your think tank, MCC, which, as we all know here in this room, is indirectly or directly channeled through the Prime Minister's office in Budapest and paid for by the Hungarian taxpayers. What, against this background, is the urgency, is the importance for you to present this book here in this city, in this bubble where the patriots are fighting Ursula and her progressive liberal elite?
And then round there.
Can I just answer? Well, the Prime Minister calls me up every morning, and he says, Frank, I would like you to write a book on... Well, the question deserves an ironical answer, because the thing is that I'm an academic that writes in my own right. You know, sort of, my book launch first occurred in London, which is outside of the bubble, because that's where my publisher is. So I write for the world. I mean, most intellectuals with integrity write for the world. But the way that I look at it is that at the same time, I'm very much, I see my role and of MCC Brussels is providing the intellectual resources that members of the Patriots Group, for example, can draw on. I think that MEPs from France or from the Czech Republic or Austria can benefit from what I've done because we have a common challenge, which is that of making sure that a sovereigntist orientation towards the world has got some intellectual depth. I mean, sovereignty for me is really quite important, not because I'm a chauvinist or, don't like, because I come from Hungary, I don't like Poles or Austrians, but because sovereignty to me means an understanding of certain connections that are essential to take forward into the future. That used to be, that orientation used to be called humanism. And if you look at the European experience, from the Renaissance onwards, where humanism first begins to kick in, all the way to Spinoza in your country, these ideals were seen as being quite important. And so, in a sense, the way that I look at it is that what we're doing, and this book is part of that, is developing an intellectual and cultural narrative that challenges what the European Commission and their allies are promoting. So this could be an exciting exchange of opinion. I would love for somebody from their side to say, Furedi wrote this is what I think about it. Because believe it or not, I learn from my political opponents. Your political opponents often see things you don't do. And sometimes, even if I think somebody's an idiot, I always at least find out what is it that makes them think the way that they do, which then forces me to rethink, my own views. So I'm hoping that the book will provoke a debate. I was very disappointed when the bookshop canceled the discussion, because that's not a good sign. But there's nothing better when somebody who's on the left or a green, sort of reviews my book and says, this is what I think. Because then we can have a grown-up discussion rather than what we have at the moment, where people only talk to people like themselves.
Frank, sort of continue that thing. Just want to ask you, particularly in terms of history education, how you would see what you're advocating playing out in our very, very multicultural society. So when you talk about the uprootedness and the lack of roots, etc., when you look at how different European countries have become so multicultural, if you like, with 10-15% more of their populations from very different backgrounds. How do you achieve what you're talking about in that context?
Just behind you, the mic to the white shirt.
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to add to the German question, really, because it seems that the problem is not just, Frank, that we have to kind of have a kind of totting up in the historical balance sheets of the goods and the bads and say, well, maybe on balance there was more good in Germany. But that it's perfectly possible to look back at the great moments or the great figures in, say, German history and say that those have value in and of themselves. They're not dependent on us looking back at, say, the Holocaust and suddenly everything that came before it is invalidated. And it seems that that's precisely what does go on today quite a lot, that American history, the great development of American democracy, is said to be essentially contaminated because of the existence of slavery, and similarly with ancient Athens. And so it seems that we have to be kind of a bit more uncompromising in saying that whilst there were historical wrongs in certain periods or certain countries, that we can still take from the past those bits and those aspects that are inspiring or useful or kind of provide a platform for us to really build something into the future.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, just for the record, I wrote my PhD thesis on the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, which was an anti-imperialist rebellion against Britain. And in the course of writing my PhD thesis on the Mau Mau rebellion, I wrote what I think is a fairly powerful critique of British imperialism and British colonialism. Now, when I did that, and by the way, I wrote a lot on the Irish question and the oppression of Ireland by Britain as well. When I did that because it was important to, in a sense, to criticize and question some aspects of the legacy of the past. But at the same time, that did not mean that I was writing off the incredible contribution that Britain made to the world. Right? So a sense of history demands from us that we basically look at different aspects of it within that particular kind of context. I think that's a mature way of dealing with these kinds of issues. And therefore, I think that what's important for us is not to cherry pick and pick good bits and bad bits about what has gone on. I don't do that in the book. What is important is that we take our past seriously. And we take our past seriously because they provide valuable lessons, really crucial lessons about what we are and what we're about. And in a sense that, as Cicero, I think you were quoting Cicero, said, those people who do not understand their past are forever forced to become children, because you will never grow up in an intellectual sense. You will never become mature unless you've come to terms with where you've come from.
Okay. Are there any more? Yeah, we've got a question at the back there and here.
Frank, thank you. Mary Harrington has this famous line she often repeats, where she says she doesn't believe in progress. Now, this goes against how most of us feel about the past, that obviously we haven't made progress. But I think she's referring to the human condition, where now we have this unprecedented number of suicide, anxiety, loneliness. So how do you feel about this? Do you also not believe in progress?
Can we have the microphone come forward to the gentleman there? Yep. And then who else has got their hand up? And then the gentleman there and there.
Right, so my question is that so I do understand very well how it is important to have a personal relationship with the past, that it can be something that can inspire you, also that it has to be corrected, it cannot be a colonized version of the past. However, I also see that this is something difficult to master, that it can very quickly become a very sensitive and very touchy issue to people, and once they have integrated it as a source of identity, can become something very difficult to dialogue with. I had the expression recently with a couple of Belgian retired army officers in a discussion about the Congo, and it was quite difficult to speak openly with them. So my question, how you can integrate this in a way that it will still be open, yet an inspiring rapport to history.
You can bring the microphone here. I mean, there was a moment, actually, what you were talking about, when Lumumba's tooth was sent back to Congo, and the crew did a fantastic press conference, and he was genuinely angry, and he actually said in front of the foreign minister, he said, well, of course, if a foreign minister had got their way, we wouldn't be here today. We'd have, parceled it off all very quietly. But when I found out about it, when I found out about my country's history and this series of events with a former Belgian official playing this big role in this assassination and this murder and the taking of trophies, I had to do something about it. So that, in a sense, shows the benefits of having a good critical relationship with the past into the present. Gently here. Yeah.
Frank, how do we get back to normality? Because it seems we're all a bit, childish these days. We've lost the ability to navigate these difficult topics. We pick the easy option. It's either victimhood or it's blaming the other, and usually a combination of the two. Seeing as I'm teaching history here in Brussels, yes, it still happens. What message of hope can we then also give to the next generation instead of the doomism that's being preached?
Can you pass it just to the gentleman in front of you? And then I'm going to bring Frank back to sum up.
Thanks for the invitation. It's very complex, but do you know when the first time a country was forced to accept a certain historical point of view? Yeah. It was in Versailles in 1919, where Germany was forced to be the only guilty person of the war. This was repeated in 1955 under Article 7 for the partial sovereignty. So they have to recognize again they were the only people who were the origin of the war, plus the recognition of a tribunal which was not recognized in Germany. It was again repeated in 1992 with the 2-4 agreements. And if in Germany a writer dares to write a different story, he comes on the blacklist.
Well, I mean, Germans weren't exactly angels. We have to.
Neither were the British.
We have to be very clear to get a balance. We have to be a little bit clear about that.
Yeah, but war is a very. It's the only war crime is war. Yeah.
Yeah.
I pass the microphone.
Yeah. I don't agree with that. I think war is not a war crime necessarily. There are plenty of wars that are legitimate, that are that one can support. I've got no problems with supporting certain countries fighting for their independence. Anyway, so I just want to say what Mary said, Mary Harrington, about progress, because unlike many conservatives, I actually believe in progress. I think that if you look at human history, you'll find that through successive generations, we learn to be more sensitive to the needs of humanity. We become ethically more capable of altruistic behavior than beforehand. We developed all kinds of ways of behaving in a more civilized way. And if you look at human civilization, it's evolved in a way that is actually quite exciting and quite wonderful. But of course, alongside civilizational development, we also have what I call de-civilization. It's opposite tendency. There are people and there are movements who want to destroy what civilization has accomplished. There's always a tension. And as long as you understand progress is not something that exists independently, but is the product of human work and human accomplishment, then we can have an orientation towards the future that is not entirely pessimistic. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I mean, when we look at, I know it sounds crazy, but when I look at what MCC Brussels have done and the people that we talk to, when you look at the way in which a lot of young people in Germany are moving, and not just in Germany, but everywhere in Europe, are moving in the right kind of direction. When you look at the voting behavior of young people in Austria, I think a lot of them, sort of are voting in the way that I think is, really, really positive. I draw the conclusion that the solution to the problems we're discussing lies in our hands. We have got to be good enough, right? We have got to be good enough and brave enough, and we got to learn to fight. I think people, especially conservatives, in the culture wars, have reacted to things all the time and have laughed. I remember when I first heard the word political correctness 30 years ago. People were laughing, ho, 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 political correctness, it will go away. 30 years later, it hasn't gone away. And the reason why it hasn't gone away is because people spend too much time laughing instead of actually fighting against it. So, to me, the book is a call to arms. Right? We got to take ourselves sufficiently seriously. And I think that if we go out and in a confident way, sort of do the business, then there's no reason why truth will not prevail.
I just want to thank Frank. You can get his book, by the way, so buy a copy of his book. He might even sign it for you as well, write a message for hope in the front of it. I really, just before I hand over to John, I really want to thank the press club. I really want to thank Laurent and his team because they don't cancel speakers. John.
So, if you enjoyed the discussion this evening, if you thought it was interesting, you're going to love the next event that MCC Brussels is putting on. In celebration of Frank's book, The War Against the Past, on 16th of October, we're having a day-long conference to dig down deep on the issues that are raised in the book. Come along, bring whatever opinion you have. All opinions are welcome at MCC, and we'll be doing it in the beautiful Solvay Library here in Brussels. So please come along, join us in a discussion about the past and how we can make a better future. Thank you very much. Please join us for a glass of wine, those who are here. Thank you those who joined us on the live stream. Please, and thank Bruno and Frank.